The following program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors. United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations. By PGBA, the healthcare claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. From the campus of Coastal Carolina University, the Center for Military and Veteran Studies is pleased to present Military Memoirs. Hello and welcome to Military Memoirs. I'm Rod Gregg, and our guest today is Swain Piver, who was a U.S. Army officer during the 1970s in Turkey. You grew up in Tabor City, North Carolina.
That's correct.
That's a long way from Turkey.
Just a few miles.
Yeah. So you were growing up in the 1960s and in the great rural country of southern North Carolina. What was that like for you?
A lot of hard work. We had tobacco farms, and my dad also had a blacksmith shop, so I did a lot of work.
So you got a work ethic early on.
Oh, yes, very early.
Yeah.
I remember standing up on the clutch to change gears on the tractor.
Yeah. Well, now, did you do some of that famously or infamously hard work that goes along with the tobacco farming?
Oh, yes, did it all. From working in the field to under the barns and dry tobacco after it was cured.
Yeah. So how young were you when you started doing that kind of work?
Probably started driving a tractor when I was 6 years old.
6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So no problem with you adjusting to some kind of work duty in the military, I guess, if you grew up like that.
No, had discipline in both places.
Yeah. So how did you find yourself in the U.S. Army?
I had a personal letter from Lyndon Johnson requiring my attendance.
You got drafted.
I got drafted.
Right. Well, and the Vietnam War was really at a peak.
Yes.
This was, you told me, about 1969?
Yes.
Okay, so things were very hot at that time over there. And so you got that draft notice. How did you react to that?
Well, I sort of knew it was coming. I had a student deferment for 4 years of college, and of course once we graduated from college, then that deferment was gone. But pretty much knew that Vietnam was in my future.
Mm-hmm. So you decided the draft came, but you wanted to kind of take as much control of that as you could. So what did you do?
I went to see a couple of recruiters. At that time, we had moved to Conway, and I went downtown to visit an Air Force recruiter to check into flying. Decided that didn't want to stay in that long, so I talked to the Army recruiter, and he told me I had an option to use my college education to get into OCS, and I decided, which is Officers Candidate School, and I decided to go that route.
Well, that's a lot of responsibility to take on, and what motivated you to try to become an officer? Were you planning to make a military career, or what were your reasons?
No, I knew I would not make a career. I pretty much had my vocation planned out. But I decided if I had a college education, it would only cost me 10 extra months, that I would rather be an officer than to be an enlisted man, especially if I had to go to Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so you signed up, and where did you find yourself first of all?
I found myself in an old coal-fired barracks in Fort Jackson, getting tested to see if I would qualify to go to OCS.
And you did?
I did.
And so where did they send you from there?
They sent me to basic training in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, end of January 1969. Very cold.
So yeah, you're in the winter and you're in Missouri, and that's not Horry County, and that's not Tabor City.
That's correct.
Yeah, so how'd you adapt to that?
I adapted fairly well. It was cold, and the physical part was a little bit aggravating, to say the least, but I was used to it. I had worked all my life, so that was not a big problem.
So you handled the physical part all right. Now, part of OCS boot camp training is also, what would you say, mental.
Yes.
So what was that all about, and what was that like?
Well, the mental part come into play because we had to learn a lot, especially after I got to Fort Sill and got into the OCS part of it. And at the same time, you were being harassed physically, having to run everywhere you go, doing push-ups if you did something wrong, PT 2 or 3 times a day, that sort of thing. So the combination of the two would wear you down fast.
Well, and this wasn't just because somebody had a grudge. There was a strategy behind that, right?
That's correct. I think they really were trying to break you down to see if you had the fortitude to be an officer, to hold up under pressure. That was the biggest thing. They put a lot of pressure on you and to just see how you would handle it.
Well, you would have been in a class of officers, correct?
That's correct.
Did all of them make it through, or did some break down and have to leave?
Quite a few broke down and had to leave. Out of each class that we would usually, I think the percentage back then was like 30% didn't go through.
Well, wasn't this really, I mean, the time of war, you're in Vietnam going on, and you're training people who are going to be leaders possibly in the field and in combat. So there was really a lot at stake. I mean, the training was kind of a life and death thing, wasn't it?
That's correct. If you couldn't hold up under pressure, then not only was your life at risk, but those that you were under you would be at risk as well. And they wanted to make sure that you could handle that pressure.
How did you feel when you graduated?
A sense of accomplishment and a little bit of pride.
Mm-hmm. So from Fort Sill, which is in Oklahoma, you went where?
I went to Fort Gordon, Georgia. There was an overabundance of artillery officers, so they wanted some to be signal officers, and they sent me to a 10-week school at Fort Gordon to become a signal officer.
You started out then in the artillery.
That's correct.
Right, and you went through all that artillery training,
Mm-hmm.
which was live firing exercises and all that
Yes.
sort of thing. So what was it about the signal corps that you preferred, you thought, over artillery? Was artillery, first of all, what you expected it to be?
No, I expected an artillery person to be somebody behind the lines firing artillery toward the enemy. But I found out when I got to OCS that a second lieutenant in the artillery was actually with the infantry calling the fire toward you.
Right,
toward
forward
yourself.
observer type, so
That is correct.
a good target.
Right. But we were trained for it, and I really didn't mind that if that's what I had to do. But when the opportunity came to volunteer to go to the signal OCS, I took that because I liked electronics, always did, and I told them that, that was a lot of interest to me. So there were a group of about 15 out of my class who were sent there.
So you changed what's called your MOS.
That is correct.
And what does that stand for?
Military Occupation Specialty.
It's what you do.
That's what you do.
Okay, so you wound up doing Signal Corps training.
That is correct.
Where did you think that was going to take you?
I really didn't know when I volunteered for it, but when I got there, then I found out that Signal Corps officers usually were on a mountain somewhere in Vietnam with a radio relay station or something to that effect, so that we could provide communications throughout the Vietnam era.
Right, so it was really a critical job.
That is correct.
Yeah, and anytime, but particularly in combat.
Yes.
So you were thinking you were heading for Vietnam at that time,
Yes,
because that's where most people were going.
that's correct.
Right. What do you think was the attitude, generally speaking, among the Army personnel, the troops that you were serving with at that time?
The attitude about going to Vietnam?
Mm-hmm. Just a sense of morale.
Most were resigned to it. Nobody wanted to go.
Sure.
There were a few that were gung-ho that just said they wanted to go, but for the most part, nobody really wanted to go, but knew that they really didn't have a choice.
And there was a sense of duty.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
we knew that our leaders wanted us there, and if they said go, we would go. But we still had reservations.
Sure. But instead of getting orders to head in that direction, you actually got orders to head in another direction, the opposite direction, and we'll talk about that when we come back.
Military Memoirs is produced by the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies at Coastal Carolina University and is made possible in part by the Lieutenant Tab Stogner Horry County Veterans Oral History Project, which is named in honor of the late H. Otis Tab Stogner, Jr., a World War II veteran of the United States Army. The project records and preserves oral history with Horry County veterans.
They're all around us. They're the men and women who served in our nation's armed forces. In good times and bad, they've been willing to stand in harm's way to preserve, protect, and defend the legacy of freedom we enjoy as Americans. All of them gave some, and some of them gave all. We owe them a lot. So the next time you see an American veteran, say thank you for all of us.
The United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies preserves oral history from American veterans of all service branches, including the U.S. Coast Guard. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project is named in honor of the late Henry Hack Mintz, a longtime resident of Myrtle Beach who held 3 U.S. Coast Guard commands. The Hack Mintz U.S. Coast Guard Oral History Project, a key component of the United Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies.
Hello and welcome back to Military Memoirs. We're talking to Swain Piver, who was a U.S. Army officer in the 1970s posted to Turkey. Now you thought you were going to Vietnam. That's where most people were going in the Army at that time, the hot war on. Mm-hmm. But we were also in the middle of a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we had been engaged in what some people called proxy wars for a long time. But this Cold War was something pretty serious around the world, and a potential confrontation that the cold could turn hot in a hurry. So when you got your orders, what did you think? You realized, I guess, first of all, you weren't going where you thought you were going.
It was a sense of relief when I opened up my manila packet and saw that the APO address of my assignment was New York. The Vietnam assignment was APO San Francisco.
But it didn't say you're going to Turkey.
No, it had a APO number. Best I remember, the number was 0913 or 9133. And I had to call a post locator at Fort Bragg, where I was stationed at the time, to find out where it was at. And she told me she had to look it up, and she looked it up and said it was a post called Sinop, Turkey.
Had you ever heard of Sinop, Turkey before?
Never in my life.
So how did you prepare for this?
I did a little research to try to find out where it was first on the map or on the globe. And once I saw where it was at, I had a pretty good idea of what to expect when I got there.
Mm-hmm. Did you, now your MOS was still Signal Corps?
That is correct.
Okay. So did anybody brief you in advance? You have any idea what you were going to do and what when you got to Turkey?
No, when I read further into my orders, I was being assigned to Supply and Services School in Fort Lee, Virginia for 8 weeks prior to being shipped to Turkey.
Okay.
So my MOS was going to change again from Signal to Supply and Services Officer.
All right, so off you went for 2 weeks to get trained for this before being shipped out. And then the time came to head out to Turkey. And how did that all come together?
It was an interesting trip. First time I'd ever been out of the United States in my life. Flew out of JFK and went from there to Orly Airport in France, and from France to Istanbul, from Istanbul to Ankara, and from Ankara to Turkey by bus. And that was quite a trip. But it was kind of tough, but a lot better than going to Vietnam.
Well, it was, here's a farm boy from the Carolinas who's not been out of the country before, and now he's going to some place far away like Turkey. And what was the post that you were sent to?
The post was a listening site. It's actually called Tuslog Detachment 4. That was the post designator. And it was a small Army site, but we also had Air Force, Navy, British Navy, and Turkish Army. And most of them were military intelligence individuals.
So this was an Army security agency intelligence post.
That is correct.
And the purpose of it?
The purpose was to listen to communications coming across the Black Sea.
From the Soviet Union.
From the Soviet Union and their allies. And best I remember, the actual distance across the water from where we were stationed to Turkey was something like 200 miles. It wasn't very far at all.
No, and given the state-of-the-art listening devices even back then, our forces could have picked up a lot of information on the Soviet, and I guess what we were looking for were troop movements and where aircraft were going, and if there's anything different or unusual going on. Same sort of thing we were doing in Europe, Germany, listening and monitoring, and then in the Far East doing the same sort of thing, while the Soviet Union did that, of course,
to us.
To us, right.
That is correct. I talked with the military intelligence people a little. My primary job there was to supply the post, whatever they needed, including the military intelligence people, taping machines, tape, listening devices when they were being replaced with newer ones and that sort of thing. But so far as what they actually did was pretty tight. They were pretty tight-lipped about that. But you could only imagine that they were just listening to anything out of the ordinary that they could pick up on.
Well, if you were going to be put in charge of any operation at a borderline intelligence post in the middle of the Cold War, then you had to have a security clearance, correct?
That is correct. Before I was shipped over, I had to have a top secret clearance, and the FBI did investigate me back in my hometown of Conway.
So later on, did any of your friends or relatives say, yeah, these guys in suits came by and wanted to know about you?
Yeah, several of them told me about it. It was an experience for them.
Right. But you passed, obviously.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
So you were there. So basically your job was you were a supply officer overseeing the importing and distribution of the stuff that kept this intelligence base operating.
That is correct.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a big job.
It's kind of big, but the Army had a pretty good system, even though at that time it was manual. No computers involved at all. It was a card system. All the supply clerks sat at a desk with a big file cabinet looking thing on their desk that had index cards in it, said how many items we had, how many we were supposed to keep in stock, and when to reorder, that sort of thing. And that's what we did on all kinds of supplies coming into the post.
It's a pre-computer sort of arrangement, but it worked.
That's right, it worked. And it was, my job as the supply officer was really fairly easy because I had a supply sergeant. The supply sergeant had much more training in supply than my 8 weeks at Fort Lee. And basically I had to help him with managing the guys and making sure that they did what they were supposed to do.
Well, and the big concern then, historically, among the American military and leadership was, aside from a nuclear war with intercontinental missiles, was the whole idea of division of Soviet tanks coming down the Autobahn in Germany and or coming across the border in some place like Turkey. It was a tense time. Now, did any of that filter down to people like you who were kind of on the front lines listening to things here, or did it just become business as usual?
There were some tense moments. Actually, about 3 weeks after I got there, the Turks threatened to send all the Americans home. So we were isolated to our actual post. We couldn't go downtown. We couldn't do anything for about a week or two until they got that straightened out. And there was always tension between the Turkish nation and the surrounding nations. So we had to be on our toes all the time because at any point in time we may have to leave or something could flare up.
And Turkey was on the connection between Europe and Asia.
That's correct.
And it was on the border with the Soviet Union. And so always this kind of important and valued but uneasy relationship with the United States at that time.
Yes.
But those posts were really important to American national security, it was believed at the time.
Yes, we knew we had a purpose there, and tensions, it was not only between the Russians and the Turkish and the Syrians, but Israel came into play as well because we had several incidents happen with terrorists and which could cause things to flare up in the Arab countries quickly.
Did people take their job seriously in posts like that? I mean, you're isolated, and garrison duty is hard in its own way because it can be monotonous historically, and it's so were they on the edge, you think? Were they serious about what they were doing?
They were serious about what they did, but the Army recognized that and provided a lot of entertainment. The NCOs would have singing groups come through to entertain, just to break the monotony. But monotony would set in if you didn't have that type thing because there was no social life off post,
right.
None at all.
And somebody on a listening post like that, you got a bunch of people with headphones on and they're listening to everything from air traffic control type of things to radio transmissions in the military to even intercom transmissions within Soviet tanks, and day in and day out, that sort of thing, you can really, from what I've been told, kind of lose your edge because of the monotony of the whole thing, and if you do that, then you might miss something. So that would be the big concern.
That is true, and that's why they worked on a shift basis and take time off to relax and whatnot, but yes, it would get old in a hurry.
Right. Well, did you ever kind of pinch yourself and say, wait a minute, I was in Tabor City working on the tobacco farm, and I'm over here now in the Black Sea?
It was a cultural shock. When I first got there and landed in Istanbul, I said, this is just like landing in any big city in the United States. I mean, people were different, but it was a nice big city, lots of things going on. But when we took the trip up the coastline of the Black Sea to Sinop, then it changed a lot. It was a bit, I would not say backwards, but just a very different, old culture.
Mm-hmm. What about in those days, 1970, 71, facilities on our bases in a foreign country like that? What were the facilities like for our people?
The officers' quarters were like a cheap motel in the United States now. Just a single room with a bed, a couple of chairs, shower, toilet area. That was it. That's where you lived. We did have an officers' club, very small. The NCOs had their own club, very small. We had a post theater. We had hobbies that we could do. We had a place where we could develop photographs, do ceramic work, that sort of thing. And we played sports.
Mm-hmm.
But it was all contained on post.
Right, right. Well, you had gone there after this training in artillery, had been training in the Signal Corps, and then the third thing was the whole supply deal. So how did all of that, did that training all come together in some way for you? Were you was that a track you were on that was valuable?
I guess you could say it was valuable in teaching me to be flexible, which you can apply that in civilian life as well. You have to be flexible because economic things change all the time, so you have to be flexible in that respect. But it really broadened my horizons as to what the Army did. Everybody thinks of the Army as a GI with a rifle out shooting somebody, but there's many moving parts to the Army.
And intelligence was really kind of the brain that moved all those parts around.
That's correct.
I mean, you had to know what was going on the other side to
That's right.
know what to do on your side.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Knowing what the enemy was planning to do was a big plus. But sometimes they would give you false information too, because they knew we were listening.
Mm-hmm.
And they were listening to us as well.
Right. Did you ever have those moments where you stopped and there's the Black Sea and you're thinking, well, on the other side of that, there are a bunch of guys in different uniforms and a different language, and they're kind of looking at us the way we're looking at them?
Oh yeah, you thought about that all the time. You knew they were doing the very same thing. In fact, they were doing it on ships closer to us than we were closer to Russia.
Right, because they had
They had the Black Sea.
yeah, they had fleet there to
That's correct.
to do what they wanted with
That's
that.
right.
So, generally speaking, how was the morale, you think, in the Army at that time in a post like this in Turkey?
Really, morale was pretty good because most people who were there did not go to Vietnam. Some did. Some came there as a second assignment, that people who re-enlisted, that sort of thing. But a lot of us were there were just relieved that we were not in a war situation.
Mm-hmm.
So morale was pretty good.
Okay. Now, you can be in a place like that, and if you're in the military, you can feel kind of safe. But when you've got large bodies of people moving in vehicles and all this sort of stuff and weapons everywhere, there's no place that's really safe. It may be some place that's safer. But did you encounter any issues there, any problems, fatalities, anything, accidents?
Yes, about 2.5 months before I left Turkey, we had two individuals, one an Air Force lieutenant and the other one a civilian employee, who were drowned in a sailing mishap on a small sailboat. And it was a supply officer's duty to do the body prep and get them sent back to the United States. We never did find the lieutenant, but we did find the civilian employee, and we had to get him back to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But that was probably the hardest thing I had to do while I was there.
And I guess a reminder that even in a post that's considered safe, quote, in wartime, things happen.
That is true, yes. It
So
can happen anywhere.
How long were you there?
I was there for 10 months. So I had 2 years of training and 10 months of service.
Yeah. Well, you came back and you were discharged, left Turkey, came back to Fort Dix, were discharged back into civilian life, worked in business in various ways.
Yes.
And when you look back from this point at your military service, how do you feel about it?
I feel good about it. I came from a family who had military service from several generations, from all the way back to the Revolutionary War, if you traced it back far enough. But my father was in World War II, my grandfather was in World War I. So it was, I feel pride in my service, but it also helped me to get along better with people, I think, because I got to see lots of different kind of folks, and every school that I went to, it was just different kinds of folks that you got used to seeing.
Well, we appreciate your service to the country.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you joining us and sharing that with us on this program.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah. And we appreciate you joining us too for Military Memoirs.
The preceding program is made possible by the generous support of these sponsors. Conway Ford, dedicated to serving our communities and our veterans in Horry, Georgetown, and Marion counties. By PGBA, the health claims processor for the American Armed Forces, serving those who serve us. And by United Bank, with full-service banking for our community and our veterans from convenient locations.